This is Marcus Reid. Before we begin, subscribe, like, and share, because tonight I'll tell you a story about a man who didn't just lose his son. He was erased from his life, one lie at a time. Michael Harris was 38 years old and had an open wound that never healed. 7 years had passed since he last held the small hand of his son, Caleb, then just 6. The memory of that day was still so vivid it felt like yesterday. He arrived at his old house after work to find the door locked, her bags gone, and a cold note on the table saying simply, "Don't need to look for us. Caleb deserves someone better than a father who's never there." From that moment on, Alicia began rewriting the story in the boy's mind. She said Michael had chosen to leave because his son was a burden. She said Michael never wanted to be a father, that he couldn't stand Caleb, that he even tried to visit a few times out of obligation, but soon gave up because he was in love with another life. Michael tried to fight in court, tried to prove he hadn't abandoned anyone, but Alicia was good at manipulating perceptions. She masterfully crafted a narrative of victimhood, crying in front of judges, pleading fear, and claiming her ex-husband was emotionally unstable. Michael, emotionally broken from losing everything at once, was seen as too confused to offer stability. During the first few months away, Michael still tried to persist. He called, sent gifts, wrote letters, but everything kept coming back. No calls were answered. The gifts never arrived. The letters were probably torn up. He went from being a present father to an invisible man. And then came the worst blow. At a school event he managed to attend from afar, he saw his son from afar, holding the hand of another man, a temporary stepfather, and calling him Dad. Michael didn't scream, didn't run, didn't despair in public. He simply felt his soul silently sink. From that moment on, he crumbled. He fell into a psychological abyss, believing that perhaps he had truly been an inadequate father. And when he was shattered to the point where he could no longer fight, he disappeared. He moved to a new city, entered therapy, and had to learn to live with the idea that perhaps his son would grow up believing he never fought for him. But there was something inside Michael that never completely died. Hope, not of being loved back, but of one day being seen, at least, as someone who never chose to leave. The first years away from Caleb were a kind of purgatory. Michael survived more than he lived. He worked only enough to pay the rent on a small apartment and spent the rest of his time trying to understand at what point in history he had become the villain. Therapy began as a last resort, almost as a way to confirm that perhaps Alicia was right and that he was emotionally weak, incapable of bearing the responsibility of being a father. But over time, he began to revisit memories, real, vivid, indisputable, like Caleb's smile when he lifted him into the air, the way the boy called him Big Hero, or the way he hid behind his leg when he saw strangers. These memories were filled with pain, but also with truth. He understood that Alicia hadn't just pushed him away physically, she had tried to rewrite his existence in her son's mind, and that was what broke him inside. But it also became the spark of a decision. He couldn't allow the story to end like this. Then slowly, he began to rebuild his identity. He returned to work with dedication, enrolled in emotional management courses, and strengthened his mind. And each day he managed to get out of bed without feeling like he'd failed forever. He thought, if I can ever look Caleb in the eye again, I want him to see a man who fought to keep existing, even when everyone said he was finished. Time passed. Somehow, the years began to accumulate scars instead of open wounds. Michael matured emotionally, and little by little, learned to live with absence without allowing it, to define who he was. He still kept in a box every letter he never delivered, every photo from the time when Caleb still proudly called him Dad. Every time he thought about giving up, he imagined the possibility of a future reunion, even if only for a few minutes. Not to ask for love, but to say, "Son, I never abandoned you. I was just erased." When Caleb turned 13, Michael realized that perhaps the time had come to try a fresh start, even if it meant facing the harshest rejection of his life. But now there was a difference. He was emotionally whole enough to endure the hatred, the contempt, the cold words, if that was the price of proving his truth. He knew knew Caleb might never call him dad again, but if he could just stop believing he was a coward, that would be a start. When Caleb turned 13, Michael felt something different when he saw the date on the calendar. Not just longing, but urgency. He realized that if he waited any longer, it might be too late for any reconstruction. With the help of a lawyer specializing in parental alienation cases, he filed an official request for gradual reunification. He didn't want to remove Caleb from his current environment or start a violent battle, but he needed, legally, to guarantee at least supervised contact. Alicia received the notification with coldness and revulsion. She called Michael only once, more to spit venom than to engage in dialogue. "Do you really think he wants to see you? He hates even hearing your name," she said, her voice thick with contempt. Michael didn't respond aggressively. He simply said, "Even if he hates me, I have the right to prove to him that I existed." Alicia laughed bitterly and concluded, "If he finds you, he'll see exactly the loser I said you were." But Michael hung up, standing his ground, because now he was ready to face rejection and not be destroyed by it. The legal process proceeded smoothly, and within a few months, a provisional agreement authorized a first family mediation session with a psychologist present. Michael arrived with his heart racing, feeling the old fear trying to resurface, like a ghost urging him to flee before he got hurt again. But this time, he remained seated, his posture firm, not because he was confident in the outcome, but because he had learned that dignity doesn't depend on someone else's acceptance. When Caleb entered the room, Michael held his breath. The boy was taller, more serious, with a look that was no longer that of a child. It was that of a wounded, suspicious teenager, hardened by the words of someone he believed he loved and trusted. Caleb didn't say "Dad." He said nothing. He just stared at Michael with a coldness that cut deeper than any insult. But unexpectedly, Michael didn't break down. He didn't cry. He just stared back with an honest pain he didn't try to hide. The psychologist began the session by asking neutral questions, but Caleb, without even blinking, murmured, "You don't have to pretend you care now. You chose to leave years ago." And it was at that moment that Michael understood that the biggest battle wouldn't be proving his love. It would be proving that he never chose to leave. When Caleb said he chose to leave, something inside Michael tightened, as if someone had pressed on the same wound Alicia had opened so many years before. But this time he refused to bleed in silence. Everything in him screamed to defend himself, to tell the truth immediately, to expose Alicia for everything she had done. But therapy had strengthened him to understand something crucial. It's not enough to tell the truth. You have to be prepared to back it up. If he had tried to justify himself in that moment, Caleb would have seen only an insecure man trying to erase the cowardly image he already had of him. Then, his voice low and firm, Michael replied, "I understand if you believe that. I understand if you hate me for it. But I just want the chance to show who I really was and who I am." "Now!" Caleb looked away, biting his lip like someone who wants to keep hating but feels uncomfortable hearing pain that rings true. The session ended with little apparent progress. Caleb got up and left without saying goodbye. Michael sat for a few seconds, his heart heavy but aware of a silent victory. He had faced rejection and remained whole. In the days that followed, Alicia tried to reaffirm the old version of the story. She told Caleb that Michael was simply too guilty to go along with the lie, and that now she would try to play the victim. But something about the way Michael looked at him in the session, painful, yes, but not desperate, made Caleb uneasy. He tried to convince himself he didn't care, but he found himself remembering little things from his childhood. The afternoons Michael taught him to draw cars, the Sundays he called him "my little warrior," the kisses on his forehead before bed. Yet whenever these memories came, his mother's voice pushed them away as false, as distorted scenes created by a needy child's mind. Caleb still resisted the idea of seeing Michael again, but something in him knew the anger he felt wasn't pure. It was constructed, and construction can be questioned. Meanwhile, Michael awaited the next session with an anxious heart, but firm in the certainty that he could only reach his son if he remained present, even if, for now, it was only as the shadow of a truth that still needed to be unearthed. The second session took took place a week later. Michael arrived at the same time, sat in the same chair, and maintained the same calm demeanor. He didn't know how Caleb would act, but he had prepared himself emotionally for being rejected again. When Caleb entered, he didn't look at him immediately. He sat down and crossed his arms, avoiding all eye contact. The psychologist began by asking if there was anything Caleb would like to say. The boy took a deep breath and said, with restrained resentment, "I only came because they said it was mandatory. It doesn't change anything." Michael didn't argue. He simply replied, "I know you have reasons to think so." Caleb frowned as if expecting a defense, but it didn't come. The silence between them was filled with something strange. Not understanding, but a kind of cautious respect. The absence of desperate excuses made Caleb lower his guard a little, not because he trusted him, but because it contradicted the image of a selfish father who only thought of himself. The psychologist then asked each of them to describe a memory from the time they still lived together. Caleb crossed his arms more tightly. Michael hesitated, searching for something that wouldn't sound manipulative. Then he said, "I remember the day you fell off your bike. You cried so much, but then you said, 'I'll ride again when I'm strong enough not to fall again.' You were 5 years old, and even though you were scared, you tried again." Caleb kept his gaze lowered, but his shoulders trembled slightly. He remembered that day. He just didn't know his father remembered it too. After the session, Caleb left without speaking to Michael again, but this time there wasn't absolute coldness in his gaze. There was unease. When he returned home, Alicia casually asked, "Did he cry? Beg for forgiveness?" Caleb replied emotionlessly, "No, he just talked about old things." Alicia tried to laugh it off, calling it a coward's drama, trying to regain attention, but Caleb didn't laugh. That night, as he feigned sleep, he remembered how his father had lifted him off the ground that day on the bike and whispered, "You're brave, Caleb. Even when you're scared, you try again." Alicia's voice said Michael ran away out of cowardice, but that memory said he'd once inspired courage. This emotional conflict was the first crack in the wall of rejection, and while Alicia slept peacefully, believing she was still in complete control of the narrative, Caleb's mind silently began to ask uncomfortable questions. Michael, on the other side of town, was unaware of this change. He just closed his eyes and silently repeated, "I'll keep going, even if he falls, even if he pushes me again, I'll stay." Over the next few weeks, Alicia began to notice something that bothered her deeply. Caleb didn't mention Michael, but he also no longer accepted her words with the same certainty. He no longer asked hatefully where his father was. Now, he avoided talking about it, like someone who thinks for himself, albeit silently. One day, she tried to reopen the subject over dinner. "You know, don't you? He only reappeared because he's afraid of dying alone," she said in a light, almost casual tone. Caleb continued chewing, but it took him longer than usual to answer. If he just wanted to show up, he would have cried and sworn he'd changed, but he doesn't. Alicia forced a smile, trying to maintain control. "It's strategy. They always act like that in the beginning." But Caleb didn't answer this time. He just continued eating, his gaze fixed on the table, like someone trying to decide who to believe, the memory someone planted or the present someone is trying to reconstruct. Alicia noticed his silence and understood that Michael was achieving what she feared most, space inside her son's mind. Meanwhile, Michael followed all the family psychologist's recommendations, not pressuring Caleb, not demanding acknowledgement, not trying to speed up the bond. Instead, he was consistent. He showed up for sessions, waited patiently, and answered sincerely, never trying to buy forgiveness with drama. He understood that Caleb didn't trust words, so he knew he needed to prove it through consistency. In the third session, Caleb did something unexpected. He asked coldly, "Have you ever tried to see me before this?" The question hit Michael hard. He took a deep breath and replied, "I tried, many times, and every time I couldn't, I wrote something down for you and kept it." Caleb arched an eyebrow. "Kept it where?" Michael swallowed hard. "In a box, not because I thought I'd ever be able to give it to you, but because I needed to remember that I hadn't given up on you." Caleb looked away, but his expression was far from indifferent. It was the expression of someone who had just heard something impossible to ignore. For the first time, he did not end the session with hostility, but with a reflective silence, which was quietly a beginning. Alicia didn't say anything explicitly, but fear began to show in the small details. The way she asked Caleb how the sessions went, the way she watched his reactions, as if trying to predict if he still believed her. As Caleb began to ask less and think more, she realized the narrative she'd constructed was beginning to suffer small cracks. One Sunday afternoon, after a long silence between them, Alicia spoke. "You know, he's going to hurt you again. I was just trying to protect you." Caleb hesitated for a few seconds before answering, "Protect you from what?" Alicia took too long to answer, and the delay was felt. "Protect you from someone who never knew how to be a father." But the words no longer found the same firm ground within the boy. He didn't confront her, but his expression showed he was trying to remember not just what they'd told him, but what he'd actually experienced in those early years of his life. And those kinds of memories can't be completely erased. Alicia, for the first time since taking Caleb away, felt the truth, the one she had distorted, slowly rising to the surface. In the next session, Caleb asked Michael something that took everyone by surprise. "Do you still have those letters?" Michael took a deep breath and nodded calmly. The psychologist watched carefully but didn't intervene. "Yes, I kept them all. I never knew if I'd ever be able to give them to him." Caleb hadn't asked to see them, but something in the way his eyes avoided meeting his father's revealed a glaring internal conflict. He wanted to believe what he'd been taught for years, but now he needed to test that version of reality. It was then that Michael asked carefully, "If you want, I can show them to you when you're ready. Not to convince you, but so you can see that I tried." Caleb didn't answer. He got up when the session ended and left more quickly than he had before, but not out of anger. Rather, because for the first time, something new was burning inside him. The doubt that perhaps he had hated someone who fought to be by his side. Alicia expected him to return with contempt, but Caleb spent the night quiet. He didn't defend his father, but he didn't attack him either. And sometimes that middle ground is the first step toward a breakthrough. 2 days after the last session, Caleb asked to leave the house early to think. Alicia noticed his changed tone, but avoided pressing him to avoid sounding desperate. However, as soon as he left, she became restless, checking her phone every 10 minutes, as if afraid something was about to happen. And it was. Caleb didn't go straight to school. His path took him, almost as if pushed by something invisible, to the address listed in the mediation documents. Michael's address. He stood for a few minutes in front of the building, his heart pounding, as if he were about to do something wrong. He wasn't sure why he was there. Maybe to confirm that the man on the other side was still a stranger, or maybe to check that the longing he claimed not to feel truly didn't exist. When he finally rang the doorbell, his legs trembled. Michael opened the door and froze for a moment when he saw his son there, unannounced. He didn't say Caleb. He didn't try to hug. He just took a step back and whispered softly, "Come in, if you want." Caleb entered, scanning the room as if searching for signs of deception. The apartment was simple, orderly, with no hint of luxury or double life. On the living room table sat a dark wooden box. Michael studied it for a moment, like someone hesitating between protecting a scar or revealing it. Then he said in a firm but vulnerable voice, "This is where I kept everything I could never deliver." Caleb stood still. Michael didn't open the box. He simply stepped away, making it clear that the decision wouldn't be forced. The silence was almost suffocating. The boy hesitated, like someone about to set fire to everything he believed to be true. With trembling hands, he lifted the lid. Inside were letters dated every year, birthday notes never delivered, receipts for rejected mailing attempts, drawings Michael had made of himself holding Caleb's hand as a child. Drawings only someone who missed him could have made. Caleb paused, staring at a letter in his father's crooked handwriting. "I tried again today. They said you didn't want to see me. I hope one day you'll know I never wanted to be a stranger to you." Caleb didn't cry, but his fingers clutched the paper so tightly they seemed to grasp every word. Michael watched from afar, his eyes welling, but he didn't step forward, because he knew this moment wasn't about him. It was about allowing his son to see the truth for himself, even if it hurt them both. Caleb left the apartment without saying anything. Michael didn't try to stop him. He simply stood, his hands slightly facing forward, like someone ready to hold a truth, not impose a narrative. Caleb walked down the stairs, feeling as if his chest were torn between two versions of reality. One told over years, the other lived in a few minutes. He walked, feeling as if something inside him had crumbled, but he couldn't tell if it was pain or the beginning. The letters weren't dramatic nor full of promises. They were simple, painfully honest, some even too short because Michael confessed that it hurt to write too much without being sure if you'd ever see it. That didn't seem like the kind of thing someone who had never tried would say. It felt true, and that possibility terrified him. Because if his father hadn't abandoned him, then he'd spent 7 years hating an innocent, and if his mother had lied, what else could she have distorted? He still couldn't forgive his father, nor hug him, nor even say his name affectionately. But now I couldn't hate him with the same certainty either. And that doubt hurt more than hate, because hate gives direction, doubt dismantles the ground. When she returned home, Alicia realized immediately he wasn't angry, and that scared her more than any outburst. Caleb walked in and went straight to his room. Alicia waited a few minutes before knocking on the door and asking, "What happened today?" Caleb responded with something that made her freeze. "You threw his letters away, didn't you?" For a moment, Alicia lost her neutral expression. "He lied to you again," she retorted quickly. "You can't believe any cheap theater." But Caleb didn't scream. He just closed his eyes for a few seconds and said quietly, "Then you don't mind if I ask him again, with you by my side?" Alicia froze. She had always controlled the truth away from direct confrontation. Now, her son was demanding a face-to-face confrontation. She knew Michael didn't need to prove anything with words. The letters had already done that. Then, for the first time since running away with Caleb, she felt afraid, not of Michael, but of losing what she had so carefully constructed, her version of the story. Meanwhile, Michael, alone in his apartment, felt a mixture of terror and hope. He knew nothing was won, but the simple fact that Caleb had opened the box meant there was now a door, and unlike in the past, he was ready to knock as many times as necessary. Alicia began to watch Caleb as if he were a crumbling ground. Every time he fell silent, she interpreted it as a threat, not a reflection. She tried to approach him again with manipulative phrases. "You're confused because he wants to make you feel sorry for him. Your father was always good at twisting everything to make himself look like a victim." But Caleb didn't respond immediately. He simply asked, "If he didn't care about me, why would he keep 7 years of letters?" Alicia tried to argue that it was all an act, that men like that know how to use words to fool even judges. But she realized that the more she spoke, the more she seemed to be trying to convince herself. Her son no longer looked at her with blind trust. Now he watched her reactions like someone searching for signs of truth or lies. Instead of yelling or confronting her directly, he simply said, "I don't know who's right yet, but I'm no longer sure he was wrong." These words made Alicia's lips tighten. For the first time, she felt that the story she had constructed wasn't just being questioned, it was crumbling from within. Meanwhile, Michael was preparing himself emotionally for the possibility of a confrontation with Alicia, not out of revenge, but because he knew that, at some point, the truth would have to be told in his presence. The lawyer suggested scheduling a joint session with all three present and a therapist mediating. When the proposal arrived, Alicia almost immediately refused, but Caleb, for the first time, said firmly, "I want to hear from both of you. If someone is lying, I will find out." Alicia felt the ground shake. Accepting meant risking losing everything. Refusing practically meant admitting guilt, so she accepted, but with silent anger. Michael arrived at the session knowing that Alicia would try to discredit him. She began by attacking him, saying he was only there because it was convenient now. But unlike in the past, Michael was unfazed. He didn't try to justify himself with emotional aggression. He simply said, "I may have lost the chance to be there physically, but I haven't lost the love I felt for him, and time hasn't destroyed that." Caleb watched them both like someone who knows the truth is about to emerge, not in pretty words or fierce accusations, but in the emotional coherence of the speaker. The joint session room seemed quieter than anywhere Michael had ever been. Alicia sat across the table, impeccable as always, perfect posture, steady gaze, expression trained to appear both victim and controller. Michael, on the other hand, was serene, making no attempt to assert moral superiority. He knew that entering the room was already a personal victory, because years ago he would have crumbled before he even began. Caleb sat in the middle, tense, his eyes darting between them, ready to capture any hint of truth or falsehood. The therapist asked each of them to share their memories of the day Alicia left home with the boy. Alicia spoke first, describing in a firm voice that Michael always prioritized everything except family, and that she couldn't let Caleb grow up neglected. Michael listened calmly, without trying to interrupt. When it was his turn, he didn't respond, word for word. Instead, he said something that changed the mood in the room. That day, I came home to an empty house. I stayed up until dawn, thinking you guys might come back at any moment, and when I realized you weren't, I cried, holding his backpack, because it still smelled like him. Caleb's eyes widened slightly, not out of pity, but because that memory wasn't an accusation. It was too intimate to be used as an excuse. Alicia tried to intervene, shooting Michael a sharp look. He's acting out. He always does. He's good with words. But something in her tone sounded more angry than hurt, and Caleb sensed it. Her anger seemed to stem not from grief, but from the fear of losing control of the narrative. The therapist urged Michael to continue. He didn't speak heroically. He spoke with controlled vulnerability. I tried calling for months. I sent gifts. I went to the school. I was pushed away repeatedly without explanation. When I realized he was starting to call me that man, I broke down. He then looked at Caleb, but didn't try to force an emotional connection. I didn't leave because I chose to forget you. I left because I couldn't breathe anymore without believing I was exactly the monster they said you saw in me. Alicia opened her mouth to retort, but Caleb held up a hand, silently telling her to stop. He wasn't ready to declare who he believed yet, but he was clearly ready to keep listening. Alicia realized that for the first time, she was no longer the only voice in her son's mind. When Michael finished speaking, the silence that followed wasn't one of indifference. It was one of shock. Caleb stared at the table, his hands clasped together like someone trying to hold something inside. The therapist then allowed him to speak if he wanted. After a few seconds, he raised his head and, with a trembling but firm voice, asked, "If you really tried, why didn't you fight harder? Why didn't you show up again?" It was a painful question, because it came not from blind hatred, but from the pain of someone who had wondered for years why they weren't loved enough to be sought. Michael swallowed hard and answered without hesitation, "I fought until I believed I was hurting you just by existing. Every time I tried to get close, she said you cried out of fear of me, and I decided I'd rather you live a life of peace, even if you hated me, than destroyed because I insisted on being present." Caleb didn't cry, but his eyes darkened as if he were swallowing something he couldn't name. Alicia tried to regain control. "You see, he's manipulating your pain." But this time, Caleb looked her straight in the eye, his voice low, almost broken. "You said he never tried, that he left because he didn't care." Alicia froze. "And it's true," she replied automatically. But Caleb countered, "Then how do you explain the letters, the dates, the return receipts, the drawings, all a sham for 7 years? Alicia tried to formulate a response, but the words didn't come with the same conviction. The emotional security she had over her son began to crumble when he added, "I'm not saying I trust him yet, but now I know there are things I need to hear directly from him." In that instant, something changed. Caleb didn't hug Michael, didn't forgive, didn't say "Dad," but he looked at him like someone acknowledging that maybe, just maybe, there's a story he's never fully told. Alicia realized she was losing ground. Michael understood that this was just the beginning, and that he would have to continue showing who he was, not with speeches, but with a constant presence that could never be erased. After the joint session, something quietly shifted in the dynamic between Caleb and Alicia. He didn't jump to his father's defense. It was still too early. But for the first time in years, he didn't attack either. The day after the meeting at dinner, Alicia mentioned Michael's name with the same derogatory tone as always, But Caleb didn't react as before. He didn't agree, didn't reinforce the narrative. He simply remained silent, and this silence was no longer submission, it was analysis. Alicia noticed this, and for the first time she felt watched, not as a concerned mother, but as someone who needed to justify her own words. This made her uneasy, irritated. Caleb began asking spaced questions about details from the past. When did you decide to leave? Did he know you were leaving home? Did you ever let him try to see me? Alicia tried to answer confidently, but the questions came with more emotional coldness than before, like an internal interrogation. Each poorly structured answer created more fissures. Caleb still didn't fully trust Michael, but he was beginning to suspect there were reasons he shouldn't completely trust her. Feeling her emotional control slipping through her fingers, Alicia tried one final tactic. She told Caleb that Michael planned to sue to take him away from her. She hoped this would reignite her son's fear and anger. But this time, Caleb didn't react with panic. He simply said, "If he wanted that, he would have tried before. He's trying to talk." Alicia's expression hardened. "Are you going to trade your family for someone who abandoned you?" That sentence made Caleb look directly at her, and in a low voice he replied, "Maybe he didn't abandon me. Maybe I've just learned to think that way." These words hit Alicia like a blow. She didn't explode, but she rose from the table coolly and left, leaving Caleb alone, staring at his plate, unappetized. Meanwhile, Michael, elsewhere, was unaware that a silent war was being waged, but he felt he needed to remain present without forcing it, because the truth, in this moment, couldn't be pushed, only held with steadfastness. Caleb knew there was still a lot of pain to process, but now he wanted to listen, to compare, to understand. And that meant Michael was finally no longer the automatic villain of the story, but a question that still needed an answer. A few days after his last argument with Alicia, Caleb made a decision that even he couldn't fully explain. He didn't tell his mother where he was going. He simply left home early, and with his heart racing, returned to the building where he'd seen the box of letters. He didn't ring the doorbell for a few minutes, as if questioning his right to be there. Michael opened the door at the first ring, surprised but not frightened. He took a slight step back, repeating the gesture from his first visit. "Come in, if you want." Caleb entered with the same suspicious look as always, but there was something new there, a desire to understand. Without sitting down, he asked directly, "When you wrote those letters, did you really believe that one day I would see them?" Michael thought for a few seconds before answering. "I didn't know if you would see them, but I had to write as if I would see myself, because writing was the only way to continue being your father, even if you never knew it." Caleb didn't answer, but he didn't look away. They sat, and for the first time, there was silence without hostility, a silence of process. Then Caleb asked, "When did you stop trying?" Michael closed his eyes for a moment, as if reliving the pain. "When I realized I was beginning to believe you'd be better off without me. When the memory of you began to hurt me more than strengthen me. When I felt dangerous, even though I wasn't." Caleb took a deep breath. "I don't know if I can believe everything right now," he said sincerely. "I want to understand what happened before I decide what you were or are." Michael didn't smile, didn't celebrate. He just nodded slightly and replied, "You don't have to believe me now. I just want you to see everything for yourself. And if you still decide I'm not the father you want, I'll continue to respect that." Caleb didn't cry, but lowered his gaze and remained seated. And sometimes, remaining seated is the first way to accept that something needs to be. Heard to the end. When Caleb returned home, after that silently intense conversation with Michael, Alicia was waiting for him. She realized something had changed, not because he said it, but because his silence now held depth, not rejection. "You were with him," he said without asking. Caleb didn't deny it. "Yes." Alicia crossed her arms, trying to assert the same power as before. "He's using you. You'll end up disappointed when he proves he's still the same coward." But Caleb stared at his Mother in a way that instantly disarmed her. If he were a coward, he would have given up on me when I told him he abandoned me. But he stayed. Alicia felt her breath catch, because it was the first time Caleb wasn't using anger as a shield. Now he was using observation. The boy retreated to his room without a fight, and this emotional control, coming from Michael, now reflected in his son, left Alicia in pent-up despair. For the first time, she felt she was losing not only the narrative, but Caleb's emotional trust. 2 days later, Alicia appeared at Michael's door. She didn't knock angrily, but opened the door firmly when he answered, like someone who believes they still have power just by their presence. "You're destroying my son," she said, her voice thick with false pain. Michael didn't react defensively. "I'm not trying to take him away from you," she replied. "I'm trying to show him he was never without me." Alicia clenched her fist. "He was happy without you." Michael looked directly at her, and there was a dangerous calm there, not threatening, but unbreakable. Children can seem happy with lies, until they realize they don't know who they really are without the truth. Alicia tried to accuse him again. "You want to paint me as the villain to win him back." But Michael responded with something she hadn't expected. "I don't need to paint you as anything. If you told the truth, then you have nothing to fear when he hears everything from both sides." Alicia couldn't. Respond immediately, because she knew in that instant that his strength wasn't in the accusation, but in his willingness to be judged fully. And that's a kind of resistance that can't be easily dismantled. A few days after Alicia and Michael's silent confrontation, Caleb asked to be in the same session, this time not because someone ordered it, but because he wanted to. The therapist realized this meeting would be different. Caleb wasn't there to immediately choose sides, but to closely observe how each parent reacted to the truth being questioned. The session began tensely. Alicia maintained a rigid posture, as if controlling every word before it came out. Michael, on the other hand, maintained his calm demeanor, not desperately defending himself. At one point, Caleb asked, if he didn't care, why did he keep all that stuff? Alicia tried to answer before Michael even opened his mouth. Because he knew one day he would use those things to play the victim. But Michael didn't respond. He simply said, if you think I did all this to deceive you, I accept your judgment, but the whole time I wrote, hoping that someday you would see that I was still your father, even when I no longer had that legal right. Caleb didn't answer, but he noticed something important. Michael was talking about pain, not victory. When Alicia tried to accuse again, saying he only came back now because he's sorry, Michael responded with something that shook the room. I didn't come back to be forgiven. I came back to be honest. Caleb remained silent, but his eyes remained fixed on his father longer than before. Michael didn't cry. He didn't yell. He didn't lash out. He simply remained present, and that presence, firm and constant, carried more weight than any speech. Alicia, on the other hand, pressed her fingers tightly against her knees, as if every word Michael said threatened something she had guarded for years, her side of the story. The therapist watched carefully and realized, Caleb wasn't just listening, he was comparing. And when the session ended, the teenager said without looking at either of them, the next conversation, I want it to be just between the two of us. Michael simply nodded, respecting the process. Alicia tried to say something, but Caleb had already left. She realized then that she could no longer speak in his place. And for someone who lives by building stories, losing control over who listens to them is the beginning of the end. Their first private conversation took place on a Saturday afternoon in a quiet park. Michael arrived first and sat on a simple bench, as if unwilling to take up too much space. Caleb arrived with his hands in his pockets, his head down, carrying a mixture of anger, curiosity and fear. Not fear of Michael, but of discovering that perhaps much of what he had believed for 7 years might be false. He sat distantly, without direct eye contact. The silence lasted almost 2 minutes until Caleb finally said, "I still don't know if I believe you." Michael took a deep breath and replied immediately, "I do, and you have the right not to believe." Caleb frowned. He had expected resistance, insistence, but he received acceptance. "But I want to understand, even if I decide to remain distant later," the boy added. This time Michael nodded. "Understanding is a start, even if it doesn't mean calling me Dad in the end." Caleb swallowed hard. The fact that Michael didn't demand love or closeness made it clear that this conversation wasn't a battle for affection, it was a lawsuit for truth. Caleb then asked something he'd been holding back for years. "When did you realize I didn't know you anymore?" Michael took a few seconds before answering, his voice cracking but firm. "When I went to your school and saw you calling another man Dad, I understood that someone had filled my place, not because you didn't love me, but because you believed I'd abandoned you." Caleb kept his gaze fixed on the floor, his hands shaking slightly. "Did you hate me for that?" he asked, almost whispering. "I never hated you. I hated the idea that you grew up believing I wasn't enough to stay," Michael said sincerely. Caleb took a deep breath. There was no forgiveness in his eyes, but the same hatred was gone. Just a boy trying to understand the kind of pain that turns a father into a ghost and a son into someone carrying a learned grudge. For the first time, he said something that sounded different. "I still don't know who you are, but I want to find out for myself." Michael didn't smile. He just nodded, like someone who understands that some rebuilding doesn't begin with hugs, but with the simple act of remaining seated next to someone who hasn't yet decided whether to stay or go. When Caleb returned home after his conversation with Michael, Alicia immediately sensed something had changed. But this time, she didn't react with anger. She reacted with staged fragility. She sat on the couch, sighed deeply, and when he approached, said with a broken expression, "If you believe him, that means I'm the liar in this story. And I've done everything for you alone for years. Are you going to throw me away like this?" Caleb hadn't expected this subtle emotional attack. It wasn't about Michael now, but about putting him in a position where he would have to choose between the truth and his mother. Alicia wasn't crying desperately. She was crying calculatedly, the kind of tears that carry guilt, not pain. "I stood alone while he rebuilt himself. I held all the nights you cried. Are you now saying I was the villain?" Her voice broke perfectly, convincing to anyone not deeply familiar with the emotional game. Caleb felt his chest tighten. He wasn't cruel. He never wanted to see his mother as a liar. But now, for the first time, he began to realize that loving someone doesn't mean blindly accepting everything they've built. Love also means facing truths that can hurt. He didn't yell. He simply replied, calmly, but firmly. "I don't want to choose between you two. I just want to know the whole truth, even if it hurts." Alicia felt this blow more strongly than any confrontation. Because Caleb wasn't saying she was a liar. He was saying that maybe she hadn't told him everything, and that meant he didn't hate her, but he also wasn't relying solely on her narrative anymore. Instead of arguing further, Caleb retreated to his room, where he stared at the ceiling for hours. He loved his mother, but now he understood that love and truth don't always go hand in hand. Meanwhile, Michael, in his apartment, was unaware of the emotional attack Alicia had initiated. But he continued preparing for the next step, proving to Caleb that he would remain in his life even if he wasn't yet called Dad. Because rebuilding doesn't happen with immediate acceptance. It happens by remaining present, even when someone's heart is still full of doubts. The following week, Caleb decided he wanted more time with Michael, not like a son returning to his father's arms, but like someone trying to understand a chapter of his life that had been ripped from him. He asked to see him again, this time without a script, without therapy. Alicia heard this and reacted, no longer with anger but with quiet fear. She didn't scream. She simply said, "If you go, you may never be able to look at me the same way again." This time, Caleb didn't hesitate. "Maybe I need to look at you differently, to understand." Everything. These words hit Alicia like a sentence she never expected to hear from her own son. She tried to cry again, but the emotion sounded hollow. Because now Caleb was no longer driven by her emotions alone, but by the search for his own truth. He walked away, leaving Alicia sitting on the couch, this time truly shaken alone, not because her son had abandoned her, but because she could no longer control him with the same tools she'd used for years. When Caleb met Michael again, there was no hug or smile, but there was something new, a sitting side by side without so much tension. They walked through a park, and at some point, Caleb said, "I'm still angry, but I don't think it's just at you. Maybe I'm angry for believing a story I didn't have a chance to confirm." Michael didn't try to explain anything at that moment. He simply replied, "You have a right to feel all of this, and I have a duty to stay here, not to defend myself, but to prove in time who I am." Caleb nodded. Slightly. He still couldn't call him father, but now he couldn't call him stranger either. He was in new territory. Painful, but true. And in that shared silence, there was something stronger than forgiveness. There was a beginning that wouldn't erase the past, but would allow it to be authentically rewritten. As they walked, Michael smiled not for victory, but for something more dignified. The chance to exist again, not as a hero, but as someone willing to reclaim his place with honesty. The following months were marked not by hug-filled reunions, but by small gestures. Caleb continued to visit Michael little by little, sometimes to talk, sometimes just to sit quietly beside him. Sometimes he asked him to explain parts of the story he'd never understood. Other times he simply asked how he felt seeing his own son calling another man his father. Michael always responded calmly, without trying to shift the blame onto Alicia. He didn't want to destroy his mother's image. He just wanted to rebuild his own with dignity. Alicia, for her part, began to feel the weight of a truth she could no longer contain. She hadn't lost her son, but she had lost her grip on what he believed, and this forced her over time to face herself. There were no longer villains and heroes in Caleb's mind, only human beings broken by choices, lies, and fears. Trust was still distant, but the resentment was beginning to transform into something else, a desire to understand and perhaps a day to forgive. One late afternoon, as they walked again in the same park where they'd first met alone, Caleb suddenly stopped and said, "I don't know if I can call you Dad yet." Michael just nodded. "I'm in no rush. Calling someone Dad isn't about blood, it's about trust. And trust is built over time." Caleb pressed his lips together, took a deep breath, and murmured, "But can I call you Michael? For now?" Michael looked at him, and this time he allowed himself a slight smile, not of victory, but of recognition. "Michael is perfect until you decide what comes next." They continued walking, not as father and son fully reconstructed, but as two men at different stages of grief, learning slowly to transform wounds into history and history into new beginnings. And sometimes that's stronger than a quick forgiveness, because when the truth finds its way, it doesn't return as a scream, but as a presence that finally no longer needs to be denied.